The system that we call democracy right now has a lot of closed door, non-transparent decisions that are made and often imposed on people in ways that really deepen inequity and often further oppression. And I think that there's an opportunity with real democracy that looks very different.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Shari Davis is a TED speaker, a participatory budgeting facilitator, and as she defines it, a recovering local government employee. She joined the Participatory Budgeting Project, PBP for short, after nearly 15 years of service and leadership in local government. As Director of Youth Engagement and Employment for the City of Boston, she launched Youth Lead the Change, the first youth participatory budgeting process in the U.S., which won the U.S. Conference of Mayors City Livability Award. We spoke at the end of February, and I was very excited to talk to Shari because of her work on participatory budgeting, which seems to be one of the most promising new ways for everyday citizens from all walks of life to supervise and have a say in how public funds are being spent, which has the potential for having enormous impact on corruption, on efficient use of funds, on creating better, more efficient, and more impactful programs, and also a huge effect on how people feel about their government. And all of this is already happening around the world. So I was very excited to hear about this from someone who's really leading this movement. So it was really fun to chat with Shari. She's clearly had a lot of practice at connecting with and including many different kinds of people. And so she puts you right at ease, and she can use humor effectively. But it was the topic of the conversation that was really amazing to hear about. We heard about how her early involvement in martial arts as a kid really shaped her attitudes towards practice, responsibility, and community. We learned about how she initially got involved in the city government in Boston, eventually leading the youth department and bringing together resources and services for the youth of the city into one place. And then how she was asked to lead Youth Lead the Change. And essentially, the city earmarked $1 million to be spent however the youth decide it should be spent, and to make essentially to use the power of participation to make better decisions. And how that whole process unfolded and really yielded some very reasonable and a very cool budget if you go line by line. We talk about the US democracy's fatal flaw, how a lot of decisions happen in non-transparent, closed doors ways, in ways that deepen inequality and division. And we talk about how to run and lead a successful, inclusive, participatory budgeting project, whether you're a local government, a school, a nonprofit, or a national government, and why that makes such a huge difference. So what stayed with me is this idea that by bringing people together and putting them in the right kind of process and paying attention and designing the process itself, how much better decisions are. Talking to Shari was really energizing and hopeful, and this is one of our goals with every conversation we bring you, including several conversations we already have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, entrepreneurs, and activists who are working to change our world for the better. So if you're interested in these types of hopeful conversations, follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app, or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Shari Davis. All right. I'm sitting here with Shari Davis. Shari, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So usually these days we start with a COVID exploration by asking, where were you in the world when this thing hit? How did it affect you personally and professionally? And then anything you learned or surprised you?
When COVID hit, what I remember is being in California in the Bay Area
Mm,
and realizing about a month before that I had been traveling. And I used to travel so much for work. I was on the road somewhere between 30 and 50% of the time. So the last place I had traveled to was Nashville to do some work with some community organizers around participatory budgeting. And I remember eating hot chicken and it was great. And then back in the Bay, about a month later, really thinking about, whoa, I don't know when that'll happen again. Um, Remembering airplanes and the conversation around travel shifting drastically. And that really was kind of the theme of the pandemic. It started maybe in my thinking about relationship to travel,
mm,
then being able to see my family, being able to see my local community, and really having to think about maybe what was normal for me before isn't normal now, and different things became normal. And so while I was on a plane significantly less, I found myself really investing in different ways of connecting with my neighbors who were local to me and
mm,
maybe even on the other side of the planet. And so one thing that surprised me was the depth of some of my international relationships during the pandemic. And I won't say that I love Zoom, right?
mm.
Or I won't say that I love video chatting. But one of the surprising benefits in my life as a person that traveled a lot was some different connection with people, was a different
Mm.
way to really invest in being with people. And that kind of really has surprised me during the pandemic.
Yeah, I definitely feel the same way. I celebrated my 40th birthday in Zoom with people from all over, right? Like with like friends from America, friends from UK, friends from Israel, and it's like some of them never met each other. So that
Right.
was really interesting. And that seems to like
Well,
keep
happy
improving. Like
birthday
we just
also.
no, I mean that was 2 years ago already, almost. So, but it's for it's the beginning of the pandemic. But but we were constantly trying new tools, and we just the other day tried this new tool called Gather, which gives you like little gamified characters to move around in this virtual space. And whenever two of the characters meet, it starts a video chat. And that was so much fun. Like we were like with a few people on this meeting, and it was just like making jokes that you would never make on a Zoom call, right? So these little things that I find technology can sometimes it doesn't replace the human, but it facilitates it, right?
Yeah, my relationship to video games is certainly changing
Yeah.
too. And again, I mentioned Zoom or finding different ways to be with people, but that feels so resonant. I think about my niece who just turned 13 and
Mm.
how we don't jump on Zoom to talk to each other, but we will certainly get on Roblox and play video games and find each other actually in virtual spaces and learning how to interact and learning from her. Really, she's an expert at this point,
Nice.
teaching me how to show up in space and what to do. And then I translate what is happening to her mom. So again, I think that's a really surprising space. I wasn't
Mm.
expecting to meet my niece, right,
Mm.
in a virtual pizza shop and for us to have an experience of making pizza together.
That's great. Yeah, that's really funny. My nephew and niece are too young for that yet, but I'm sure it's coming. Sure it's coming. So there's this question I like to ask in the beginning to connect the person to what they do today and see if there's some sort of pattern. And so what's something you learned in childhood or early in life that still guides or drives you today?
Something I learned early in childhood that I find is a really guiding thing is practice. The
Mm,
idea that when you practice, you are able to explore things. You are able to practice maybe a thing that you knew. Maybe it will open up things that you didn't know. you're able through practice to notice things, maybe recognize an adjustment, maybe explore something that you didn't see before. And my relationship to practice started through martial arts. When I was 9 years old, I started training in martial arts. And before that, I was really interested in martial arts. I was dying to practice. All I wanted to do was practice. And I remember my dad holding up his hands and him saying, let's practice, and didn't exactly know what I was doing, but I was practicing something. And then when I started martial arts class at a community center in Boston, I really had a chance to just get a taste and learn a little bit and go home and practice these 2 or 3 techniques. And I wanted to learn 752 techniques at once, but I only had 3. And in order for me to get more, I had to practice more. And then people could teach me things. And I found that if I practiced really hard, I may even learn something on my own. And I had this beautiful relationship to what practice offers individuals and communities and how you can build a practice of practice. And so now I look back on that and I find that I'm a pretty relentless practicer. When I learn something, I want to find different ways to practice it, especially if it serves me and the communities that I'm in.
I'd love to hear an example in a minute, but like you also, I mean, you reached black belt, at a fairly young age. Am I right? And that opened doors for you as well.
That is true. It sounds like you did a little bit of research. I started training when I was 9. And my practice led me to receiving my first degree black belt when I was 12. And what's unique about that, in addition to the fact that I was 12, was when I started training, I started teaching when I was about 10 years old. So about a year after I started training, I started instructing others. And my journey as a young instructor, young in martial arts, and both also as a young person, was I was good at it. And I practiced it more. And I developed some skill in facilitation. And I developed some skill in building a lesson and recognizing what was on the floor, what needed to happen, what adjustments we could make individually and collectively. And I embarked on this journey of practicing teaching. And because I like to practice so much, I showed up a lot. And then I had this opportunity to test for my advanced degree, for my black belt. And in the style that I trained in, you could test and you just get maybe your black belt. And each degree that you get after that is actually in relationship to your teaching practice. So in the style that I studied, to test for your black belt and receive a first degree was a big deal and a testament to the instruction that I had done thus far. That was actually really unique and incredibly special. It was one of the proudest things that I think I have ever done, right? To be 12 years old and to be recognized as an instructor. My parents at times were my students. Folks that had 40-hour work weeks were lining up to take a class from me. And it was an incredible responsibility and joy to be able to invite folks into that. And so you're right. Yes, I got my black belt when I was young, when I was 12 years old, and continued to teach and train and be in this culture of martial arts for a really long time.
So what is an example of practice outside of martial arts? Where do you connect that?
Well, one of the places that comes to mind for me is in shared leadership. And I have a chance to practice shared decision-making on a lot of levels, especially when we talk about what participatory democracy is and what community-led decision-making offers us. And personally, as a leader, as a person that kind of helps to run a national nonprofit organization, I have the opportunity to practice shared decision-making, community-led decision-making, shared leadership on a very big and also really small level. So at PBP, the Participatory Budgeting Project, I serve as co-executive director. And that means that there are two other amazing folks that also serve as co-executive director. And so together, the three of us kind of build a structure of shared leadership. And while we have our own responsibilities, we also build a really expansive culture of support and honesty so that we can run this organization efficiently. It requires practicing trust building and relationship management and deep communication, and also being able to hold each other accountable. And sometimes what I practice is actually not making a decision and facilitating a team toward good decisions. And so a lot of my practice right now is in that space.
Yeah, and I think that's very evident. So we're looking at events and just seeing how you address each person and acknowledge them and make sure they speak up and give you, their name. And it's evident that you're practiced in bringing people into the process as opposed to letting them mumble or letting them not fully stand up and participate. So what does the journey look like from being a 12-year-old Black belt to the world of local government?
Yeah, I mean, naturally, folks become martial artists and Black belts and instructors and then land at government. My journey was, and especially remembering that my gateway to martial arts and community programming was a community center for kind of young people in the city of Boston. And that's where I began to meet other community leaders, folks that were familiar with something called the Youth Employment Program that put thousands of young people to work in the city of Boston. And I applied and found myself with a summer job working in the mayor's office. And my job was at the Mayor's Youth Line. And it was to help young people find resources and opportunities. Isn't that interesting? I found a resource and opportunity at my karate program. Now I'm working at a place where people are looking for resources and opportunities. And so a young person would call and they would ask a question like, I'm looking for a cheap date idea, or I'm trying to find a program like baseball or basketball, or I need a tutor or whatever it was. And we went through this database that we were building and cultivating of resources for young people that had been vetted by young people. And so I often had to go and vet and make sure these resources were available and see what was happening and begin to build channels of communicating that to other youth. And then the summer came to a close, right? 2 months is over. And they said, this was really nice. Thank you for coming. Enjoy whatever you do next. And I was like, how could you possibly, who will do this? How could you possibly connect young people to resources if I'm not here, if other young people are not here? I'll keep coming back. I'll see you tomorrow. And after several tomorrows, they were like, yeah, maybe you're right. This makes a lot of sense. You're going to keep coming back. And I found myself working in local government for almost 15 years. I started overseeing that employment program that I was employed in. And I was helping to put thousands of young people to work at 250 community-based organizations across the city, building relationships with all of these entities that were employing young people as camp counselors. They were working at museums and the aquarium and building all of these skills. And in that role, I started to ask some questions about, well, how do we streamline some of this? I'm remembering that as a young person, I had to go one place for a job, another place to serve, maybe on the Mayor's Youth Council, and other places for everything else. What if we kind of built one place altogether for youth? And I started asking that question to other young people. And then the Department of Youth Engagement and Employment was born. That was built by young people for young people to connect them to employment opportunities and engagement opportunities across the city. And that was one of the coolest things, right? So talk about seeing a system maybe change, a system of government change, a department that didn't exist before, now existed. It's not run like how other city departments are run. It was actually kind of run with the consent of young people, the young people that were paid to be there, that had ownership of this new department. And so my journey in martial arts and instruction brought me into government, but it brought me in this kind of like really unique way where I had a chance to work on and maybe even see systems change up close. I had a chance to see young people respected in their expertise as part of the way that my career started. And I think that's all a big way of why government was interesting to me as something that could be adjusted, changed, reflective of the people that work there.
Yeah. And it's interesting that, tell me if this is just my imagination, but I feel like I'm seeing like a connection between you being taken very seriously, actually, at a young age, given an opportunity to train even adults, and then coming into local government and expecting the same thing, right? Like saying, I'm not going anywhere, right? You're going to take me seriously.
I think that's true. I think it is a thread. And there are a couple pieces of that thread that are true. I had supportive adults and other young people around me that believed in me, that also believed in my expertise. When I practiced, I was in a safe space to build skills and build some confidence and take that into other spaces. And I learned that I could be trusted in roles where I felt responsibility and I could be built up and I could build networks with folks that were doing the same thing. So my relationship to, what I thought was possible, I think was really different. But the bigger thing for me was growing up, my relationship to what communities could do together, I think was really different. And that was the thread, right? So I knew if I show up, I can learn things and do things. I know if I show up with people, we can change things. And that's what my experience was and the common thread for me.
Cool. So you call yourself a recovering government employee at some point, and you talk about democracy's fatal flaw. Yeah. What's wrong with democracy, U.S. democracy? What's missing?
My response is kind of what's not wrong with it. I think what we call U.S. democracy right now is a system that is built on a lot of oppression and systemic inequity. The system that we call democracy right now has a lot of closed door, non-transparent decisions that are made and often imposed on people in ways that really deepen inequity and often further oppression. And I think that there's an opportunity with real democracy that looks very different. And democracy is an opportunity for us to make decisions together. And we've seen an approach in the United States for a really long time that has borne very specific outcomes. And so that's what's wrong with it. It has to change to be closer to actual shared decision-making, where folks are able to come together, make informed decisions, and have a flexible system that changes and evolves with people. And so if we've seen the same system for a long time that offers us really inequitable outcomes, then we have to change it. And so part of what's wrong with American democracy today is that it hasn't changed very much.
Yeah. You talk about how our moral imaginations have grown anemic. It's a powerful phrase. And then at the same time, the way you approach it seems hopeful. You treat democracy as a living thing. You say it's our birthright. We can reclaim it. So I think it started in Boston. I think it started with your discoveries there. But how did you become convinced initially that democracy could work better?
One of the things that I used to say about government is that inside-outside strategy is the most important thing. And I believe that right? We have to have folks that are in the inside and know how the system works to be able to shift and move it. And we also have to have folks on maybe the outside that are organizers, to have community members at the center that are also helping to shift and build that system. And while that's true, I think that there also needs to be the enabling conditions for community members to actually do things, to actually participate in the decisions. Oftentimes in government, we see consultative processes where community members are asked so much. They show up at a meeting, they arrange childcare, they change their dinner plans, they skip dinner, and then what? Maybe this single parent that comes to the meeting 3 weeks later, they might read something in the paper or never again about how their participation was considered in a big decision that was made. Maybe there's no way to tell if their participation was considered. And so I saw that process, that consultative process, a lot in government. And I heard it called democracy a lot too. And I think consultative processes offer benefits. You get information and it's only valuable if you use it. However, one of the things that really changed my opinion of what was possible was every moment that I saw community members able and enabled to make decisions together. That was a different kind of government that was being modeled. That was a different way of doing business that was being modeled. And it opened the door, expanded the door for me in terms of what was possible. Community can decide. And not because it sounds good, but because it's better. We make better decisions together.
Yeah. So with Youth Lead the Change, you're essentially given, if I have it right, $1 million of city funds and told, figure out how you want us to spend this, essentially. What did that process look like? If I would play the devil's advocate, it sounds like the government shirking their responsibility and saying, you figure it out. So how did it go about and what actually happened?
So we start with Youth Lead the Change, and the mayor didn't say, here's $1 million, go crazy. What the mayor said was, there's $1 million in our capital budget, and I want to make the best decisions possible about how this $1 million is invested in our city. And I believe that the best way to do that is to have young people decide what those investments are. Now, this mayor, Mayor Menino, had a long history of believing, trusting, and building with young people. And so he was in a position where he said, this just makes sense. And I think a lot of folks need to be in that space where they recognize the skills, talents, and expertise of the folks that live in community and say, we can make better decisions together. He started with $1 million, got some young people together and said, look, they need to design the process. And Shari, you're the youth expert. At the time, I was the director of the Mayor's Youth Council. And he said, you know how to engage young people in decisions. I need you to run this process. It's called participatory budgeting. That was the first time, maybe, that I had ever heard those words. And I went back to my desk, Googled it, and found out that participatory budgeting was a process that allowed community members to directly decide how public funds or tax money was spent. I, as a person that worked in local government at this point for over a decade, didn't make direct decisions about the public budget. And here was a chance where young people would be at the center of it. I was excited. I had never seen it before. I had all of those questions. How is this going to work? What if people have questions? How am I going to engage thousands of people in this process? And I found that if you took time and planned for it, if you let folks design, they do design really well, even with limitations. And then on the other side of this, you do make good decisions that folks are able to use, own, build upon, iterate on. And hey, the added bonus is not just the decisions, it's that people want to participate more. And so the first time that we did participatory budgeting in Boston, Harvard University did a bit of a study on some of the young people that participated. And at the end, they noted that they were more likely to step into a government-owned building, more likely to volunteer, more likely actually to consider politics for themselves. And so what about this thread? Maybe I, as a young person, had a chance to practice, see things differently, step into leadership roles. But if we have a culture of young people across the United States that have the experience of making decisions together about public money, then what is possible for them in the ways that they might lead in government as we move forward? I'm like, those are the kinds of fabric of government that I want to see and realize and live into. They don't exist yet, but we need to be flexible enough to allow them to come forward.
And you described some of the things that you ended up investing in, including increased tech access, bringing art to the streets, renovating parks. And when you actually read that list, it sounds like that's a super reasonable, cool budget with lots of priorities. How does a group of untrained people not devolve into chaos and produce such high quality decisions where our parliamentary system sometimes doesn't? How does that happen?
Yeah, totally. Part of it is good facilitation. And I think that people are maybe untrained in the sense that maybe they haven't spent a lot of time looking at budgets. Budgets can be intimidating, right? Maybe they don't know what the city plan is, or they haven't looked at the city plan or the city's 5-year plan. Maybe if they did, they're like, I don't exactly understand what this is or how it was formed. But people actually have a lot of other training of living in a community. And so I think part of it is recognizing the training that people do have and being able to customize a process or framework that acknowledges and values that, and then maybe marries some content expertise with context expertise. And so a big part of building frameworks that don't devolve into chaos, I think, is actually designing that framework with the people that are intended to participate in it. And so when you don't do that, I think that's a recipe for chaos, right? Because you're in a field of maybe some landmines that you weren't able to see. However, if you're going to, in this instance of Boston, design a process where young people make decisions together about how to make the city of Boston better for young people and generations to come in terms of safety, equity, then you're able to engage them in saying, okay, tell me a little bit about what your lived experience says that we need. How do we need to hold this process? What information do you need? If we gave you the city budget, here it is. It's available on the website. What would be helpful for you in understanding this? What would be helpful for you in meeting a city staff member? And how do we set up a conversation where you feel comfortable to ask questions? Do you want information drawn in a map? Is that helpful? Do you want to sit in a presentation? Would you like a recording? Maybe you guys want to make TikToks. These are conversations that I think happen and design choices that are really important. And so all of that said, I think a part of not devolving into chaos is to absolutely design with, and also to establish some community agreements that are flexible and that can change. And I think the last kind of piece of not devolving into chaos is that you can only go as fast as the speed of trust. And this is where good facilitation comes in. There are moments in participatory budgeting and with deep community engagement where you have to slow down so that you can address the root causes, make sure that you've met the accessibility that's needed in the room so that we can make decisions together and honestly often heal a little bit together in the process.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show.
And so after Youth Lead the Change, you joined the Participatory Budgeting Project. And that's an organization that's done this with multiple cities, multiple places around the world. Tell me a little bit about that. How did that kind of build on what you've already experienced?
The Participatory Budgeting Project name is a bit of a mouthful, and we say PBP for short. And what I will say is I felt that. What is PBP and what is the Participatory Budgeting Project the first time that I came across them? And that was actually as a client first. So remember, I was working in government and I was trying to learn how to do PB at scale so that young people could run this process. And it was in that role that I met PBP and started practicing how to say the Participatory Budgeting Project. And one of the first things that I learned was this organization was new-ish at the time. It had only been around for 4 or 5 years. And participatory budgeting in the United States had only been around for about 4 or 5 years. It was a new concept in the country. And so it was an opportunity for me to kind of learn from some of the staff that were the first in the country to run processes like this. And everything wasn't figured out yet. There was a framework. The framework worked. There was research that was being built around it nationally and internationally. And there was a lot of space for innovation within the framework. There was still space to adapt this framework in ways that were customized to neighborhoods. And so my journey in working with PBP as a government employee was being able to collaboratively adapt the process and materials for youth leadership and for young people to lead and for city staff to really see young people as resources and talents and folks that had real lived experience that was valued. And I think for me, that was when I said, I think we're unlocking something that we can bring to communities at scale across the country and beyond that allow us to really open up the doors for government to make better decisions together and maybe even change who government is. If we're able to allow young people, like maybe what we see in Boston, to make decisions and they're reporting that they're more likely to be in government now, what if we do this across the country with young people and people of all ages? And that's where my interest really kind of evolved. And I joined the PBP team about 5.5 years ago and really had an opportunity to begin working with school districts, individual schools, cities, and for us, especially in the last couple of years, to think about what it means to build processes that center equity and that center impacted people in decisions. Because one thing that we know is folks that are impacted by decisions are also going to be closest to the solutions that work best.
Yeah. That's amazing. So I'd love to hear a little bit on the process, how to do it right. What are some tips for a city hall that wants to apply it or for a school that wants to apply it? How do you get started? It sounds like it's a huge undertaking.
While it is a huge undertaking, I will say that it gets easier. And so any change, right, at first requires a little bit of orientation, a little bit of learning, and then with practice, it becomes something that may be routine, and it might even feel good and bring joy. And I think that this is what participatory budgeting offers. And so loosely, there are a couple phases of PB. And those phases are what I describe as the framework. And how each one of those phases can happen can be really different. And this is where the design with principle really comes in. And so the big phases are these. The first one is, shockingly, design the process. And this is where community members come together, maybe with institutional or like agency staff, to write the rules that will govern the process. And questions around eligibility come up. Who's able to suggest ideas, right? Who's able to participate in proposal development? Who's able to vote? And so all of those questions are answered at the very beginning as part of the design phase. And the rule book is issued that clarifies eligibility and also maps out for folks what the process is so that it can be transparent. And then we move into the idea collection phase, which I think is really fun. And this is where we turn to community and we have conversations around what investments should be made and what are the real challenges here that need to be addressed and what are the creative ways that we can address them. And sometimes this idea collection phase happens with real easy kind of drop-in box cards, but often it happens with conversation that can happen in small groups and large groups, virtually or in person. Once we've collected ideas, sometimes hundreds or thousands of ideas are collected for a PB process, we move into the next phase, which is proposal development. And so how do you vet hundreds or thousands of ideas? The answer is that you're able to do that with community, recruiting folks to volunteer, to turn those ideas into concrete proposals. Community volunteers often work alongside city or agency staff to do some research, to price proposals out, to break down the barriers that we often see in government so that things are transparent, so that spreadsheet isn't as intimidating, and so that the ideas that came in are developed the way that community intended for them to be developed. Nothing is finalized or makes it onto the ballot unless it can totally happen, is feasible, and is going to have an impact on equity in the community. When the ballot is finalized, then we move into the vote phase. Now, this is where some real kind of fun happens. That ballot goes out into community, and unlike a local or national election, typically voting lasts for a week, sometimes two. Oftentimes, community members, regardless of citizenship status, are able to participate in the vote and cast their ballot. And then at the end of the vote, the results are announced transparently. And often there's an evaluation or debrief phase of PB so that it can be iterative and flexible because community changes and grows and we learn things every time we do a PB process. And then we begin the process again. So it's cyclical. It marks a change in the way we do business. And it moves from design, generating ideas, developing proposals, voting, evaluating, and then continuing.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. So I'm a designer and I do a facilitation of design processes that feel similar in some ways, right? We interview experts. We interview the people being affected by the problem. We sketch out ideas. We develop them on paper. Then we vote on them. A lot of these feel like a classic design processes that bring together people. And you also talk about inclusive design. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. And so by inclusive design, in taking the example of Boston, one of the big things, one of the goals in this process was equity. And the way that we thought about that in Boston, especially with the intention of designing with, was first recognizing and looking at data that kind of pointed to maybe some root causes or where inequity existed. And that data told us that especially for young people, it existed for young people that identified as houseless. It existed for young people that lived in 5 traditionally underserved neighborhoods in the city of Boston. It also looked like recognizing that young people that were low income and came from low income households had statistically higher levels of challenges and barriers compared to other young people that came from higher income households. And so those were some of the spaces that we really recruited to ensure that young people could show up. And so when we talked about designing with, a big piece of that was making sure that folks that were impacted the most were actually at the table. And that also included individuals that were formerly or currently incarcerated. And so how do we make sure that we're able to get into facilities safely so that community members that are in those facilities feel comfortable and safe to participate and have a connection to this bigger process?
Yeah, it sounds like common sense, but the kind that doesn't get applied very often.
Yeah.
So now I'd love to hear a little bit about this process of participatory budgeting as a global phenomena. So I've read somewhere over 7,000 cities around the world have went through this process in some form. It seems to have grown very rapidly. When we consider like the pace of change in government, this is something that seems to have taken off pretty quickly. What do you see happening here on a global scale? What gives you hope? What doesn't give you hope? Where could we go with this?
I love this question because you're asking me to time travel a little bit. You're asking me to travel into the future and imagine a world where we see participatory budgeting continue to grow at the rate that we have so far and maybe even more. And first of all, I'm excited about this future. The idea that more people will have a relationship to each other and to government decisions that is positive. And I think while that sounds pretty simple, I think that's a big and drastic shift. I think if we were to ask a lot of folks in Black and Brown communities across the country and across the globe what their relationship to government is right now, that would be different unless they've had a positive experience like PB. PB kind of started in Brazil, and now there have been several thousand instances across the country where millions and millions of dollars have been decided on by community members. Sometimes, whether it is in a school, whether it is in a district, whether it's an entire country that's practicing participatory budgeting together. And I think we're going to see more countries take on innovations in participatory democracy. I think we're going to see more people develop understanding of what equity is and what that means for them in their community or neighborhood. I think we're going to see more people able to build skills around making community agreements, supporting each other in a community agreement, in building some skill in having conversation. And I think we're going to see more organizations internationally sharing learnings and successes. What we learn when we see communities work together and build success is that it's even stronger when we build networks and learning communities around that. And so while we've seen this huge kind of rate of change in a global perspective, we have a major opportunity to continue to see it grow. And it's going to come down to how much we ensure that community members that are impacted are at the center. I think that's a big way that we don't fall back to systems that have failed us, but that are familiar to us.
Yeah. So there seems to be maybe at the core of this some sort of radical hope or radical sense that things could be better, and that a new idea like participatory budgeting and just like literally a new practice that a town can embrace can really make a massive difference. And as designers, we see this all the time. It's actually quite impossible to solve a problem unless you believe that you can solve the problem.
I think my hope is not unfounded. My hope, my belief is validated by the experience that I've had personally with participatory budgeting, but most importantly, what the experience of so many people has been with participatory budgeting. I referenced research from Harvard University, but look at the studies that Public Agenda puts out around what's possible or what people invest in when they do participatory budgeting in New York City. Investments shift, and you're able to kind of map and marry community spending priorities with government spending priorities and make the best infrastructure and programmatic decisions possible. That's what the data says. And so if we're able to continue to build examples of this, but most importantly, spread awareness so that folks have an opportunity to try and practice it and customize it, I think that's really important. You and I are talking about participatory budgeting, but the reality is this is so new. In the United States, still, we've only seen PB maybe now for 11 years. And a lot of people haven't been introduced to it yet. They're not aware of it yet. And so folks may be listening to this conversation and saying, whoa, I've never heard of participatory budgeting before. You're not alone. and welcome to the
Mm.
party.
What are some of the most hopeful stories that you can tell about things that really emerge from any sort of PB project, anything that sticks with you that really gives you strength, gives you hope?
Some of the biggest stories that make me think, whoa, change is possible, is when people change, is when folks model change, is when people shift and move in their opinions. And one of the beautiful things when we talk about equity is that not always at the beginning of the conversation do people see eye to eye, but through them, they are able to. And there are so many examples of this that may start with a person walking into a community meeting or a PB conversation with an idea of something that's really important to them, like a cat park. And this is like a true story. Someone came to a community meeting and they were like, I really want a cat park in my neighborhood. And these are the reasons why. And this is how it would benefit my neighborhood, and so on and so forth. And folks listened. And then when it was someone else's turn to speak, they said, I really need this to change in my kids' public school building. And the thing I need to change is I need the bathrooms to be renovated. And I know that doesn't sound cool, but when my kid goes to school every day, they're having a hard time finding a bathroom that's usable. And I think we really need this. A couple minutes later, the person that came in with the cat park says, I still do want the cat park, but maybe we can come back to that at another time, because it sounds like there are some different kind of needs here that maybe we need to prioritize together first. And that, I think, is where hope lives.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great story. Cat park would be nice, though I'm not sure cats need a park. I'm not sure.
I may not be a cat person, but there's a cat person
around in the
out
park.
there. Yeah, there's a
No,
cat person out there that's excited about
Yeah.
a cat park. And we're not saying that it can't happen. Let's just all make sure that we're talking about the needs that we have first.
Yeah. But so far, my cat has not shown any inclination of going down to the park. There's no interest there. But I have this closing question that I usually ask. So in his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture kind of being like the modern day secular, like here's a little bit of information, you figure out what to do with it. And a sermon being the more primal, like an urgent plea to change someone's life. And his point is we need more sermons. And so I would like to ask, if you were given a stage to give a short sermon to young people, what would be your message to them? What's the one thing that you really want to convey?
I would borrow from Octavia Butler here. And my sermon to young people is that all that you touch, you change. And all that you change changes you. Change is inevitable. And what I would maybe riff is that it can be really scary, especially when you rally against it. But you can work to shape it. And this inevitable thing that is change, that's a part of you, that maybe is you, can be really beautiful. And if it's inevitable and it's going to happen, what does it mean for us to be close to change in ways that make it the best as it possibly can be? I think that is the sermon. It is honoring, respecting, and building a practice around change. Not only is that how we survive, but that's how we thrive together. I think that's how we build relationships with each other that are innovative. That's how we ensure that we're cared for. Change is the sermon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was such a joy.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.